Unit 6, Section 3 is about key events relating to the consequences of the war. So what happened after the war? Well, this period of time is known as Reconstruction. Reconstruction lasted from the end of the war, 1865, until 1877. There were two plans to handle the period after the Civil War. One was referred to as Presidential Reconstruction, and that was led by Abraham Lincoln, the president, and his plan was to be lenient towards the South and the Southern states re-entering the Union, the Southern commanders, Southern legislators, Southern governors, Southern mayors, assuming back control of their states. Lincoln's plan only called for 10% of Southerners to swear an oath of allegiance to the Union, maybe something like the Pledge of Allegiance back to the Union, in order for their states to re-enter the Union. Lincoln did not get to carry out these plans because he was assassinated 5 days after the Civil War ended by John Wilkes Booth while he attended a play called Our American Cousin. His vice president, Andrew Johnson, took his place, and this is ironic, but Andrew Johnson was from Tennessee. And Andrew Johnson is going to follow Abraham Lincoln's lenient policies. The alternative plan presented was by the congressmen, and the congressmen that were known as the radicals. Now, these were mostly northern legislators, congressmen, who were upset about what the South had done, seceding from the Union, and they offered a more harsh punishment towards the South, and their plan, in direct opposition to Lincoln's, called for 50% of Southerners to swear an oath of allegiance to the Union before they could re-enter. This was impossible. The Southerners are angry over the war. It's very unlikely that you would get 50% that would be willing honorably to stand up and say a pledge to the United States of America. And the radicals knew this, and this was their plan, is to keep the South out of the Union politically as long as possible until they could obtain control. Johnson, vice president, now president of the United States, has these radicals push through these 3 amendments and the Freedmen's Bureau, and in each case, Johnson attempts to slow them down, and even in like the case of the Freedmen's Bureau, to veto them. The first amendment pushed through by the radical Republicans was the 13th Amendment, and that granted freedom to slaves. That was in 1865. In 1868, the radicals pushed through the 14th Amendment, and it was eventually ratified by the states, and that granted citizenship. It also overturned a long-standing now Supreme Court case known as Dred Scott, in which the Dred Scott Supreme Court case had said that slaves were property. Well, now with the 14th Amendment, that's no longer the case. And then 2 years later, in 1870, the 15th Amendment was ratified, and that granted African American men, the right to vote. A legislation that the radicals passed that Johnson had an opportunity to veto because he felt like it went too far as interfering in Southern ways was the Freedmen's Bureau. It was a government agency which assisted former slaves with things like especially education, food, jobs, clothing, and medical attention. One other thing that the Freedmen's Bureau did was that it started a lot of elementary schools for young black children across the South, led by volunteers from the North, but also it actually started colleges. The original one was called Augusta College, and it was later renamed Morehouse College, and it was founded in Atlanta in 1867 as a seminary. Last but not least, one of the things that the radicals tried to do was redistribute land redistribution. And this came in the form of sharecropping. Farmers in the South were forced to turn parts of their land over to their ex-slaves in exchange for the slaves would provide them either part of their crops or the profit off of those crops. And there were two forms of this. It was either sharecropping or tenant farming. Very similar. Tenant farming was just renting the land from the original farmers. The problem with sharecropping and tenant farming is it kept the slaves basically in slavery, maybe without the chains, because they would stay in a constant state of debt with the slaveholders. This concludes Unit 6, Section 3, the consequences of the Civil War.